Well, oh, it's not recording. Now,
All right. So welcome back, everyone. So today we have the paper presentations. Just generally, quick kind of updates on the plans for the rest of the quarter. So today we're going to finish the paper presentations of Group 3, right? All the people in Group 3. It's about control flow integrity, as we discussed last time. So you're going to learn a little bit about different types of control flow integrity, attacks and defenses. I'm going to also make some comments after each presentation. Hopefully it would be good for you to kind of solidify what we have learned about control flow integrity. If you have time today, I'm going to try to finish the attestation parts that we started last time. Let's see how much time we have. Whatever remains, I'm going to finish it on Wednesday, and then we're gonna, depending on how much time we have, we're gonna talk a little bit about trusted execution environments and other topics that we want to talk about. That will be basically all the things that we're gonna cover in your exam, which is next Wednesday. I'm gonna also post a sample exam of last year and last 2 years. You can actually even see it on the website yourself if you want to study sooner. But generally, you can expect questions to be a combination of short answer, a little bit long answer questions, and then some true or false questions. They will be all based on the lectures as well as paper presentations. Not the papers themselves, but the paper presentations, including today's paper presentations and Mondays. So everything say up until Monday of next week will be fair game for the exam. And then next week, we're going to also have the last group presentation. And then the week after, in week 10, we're going to do project presentations. I'm going to also do some review on some new topics that's not going to be part of the exam. We may have also a short guest lecture by someone from industry. We still haven't finalized it. It's a little bit difficult for industry to get like all the approvals in time. So we may or not get it in time, but if it didn't, whenever I have that talk, I'm going to post it on the class website for whoever is interested to take a look. Is there any questions? In terms of, yeah.
So just for the front, what is final exam again?
Next Wednesday, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. In class. And in terms of computer assignments, there will be third computer assignments, which will be probably released sometime either end of this week or early next week. You're gonna have a few weeks to finish it, and then your final projects, of course, are due week 10. For the presentation, I usually have I might give you like one more week to kind of finishing up the things that you want to do for your final projects. Any other questions? All right, so we have the first group talking about auto control flow integrity. So please, guys.
All right, so my name is Kaylon Kelly.
My name is Jacob Levinson.
My name is Vincent.
And then our presentation is on out of control, overcoming control flow integrity. So what's the problem? The problem is that of control flow integrity. In theory, ideal CFI will wholly eliminate all control hijacking attacks, like those using ROP, JOP, return to libc, and other techniques we've discussed in class. And it does this by labeling every instruction of a legitimate control flow transfer, and then at runtime, checking the labels of every transfer. So we can see in the CFG on the right, the indirect calls from the sort function can either go to the less than function or the greater than function, and both of those have unique IDs, and the returns can only go back to the instruction directly after the indirect call. And because of that, it checks before the indirect call to make sure that it's only going to either of those two places, and then both returns check to make sure it only goes back to the instruction directly after the indirect call. The problem is there are a couple issues with it. And one of them is that it requires a lot of debug information and source code, and that's typically not available for commercial software. It also incurs an insane runtime overhead of up to 50%. And so because of this, in practice, relaxed CFI rules are generally used, and these are also generally exploitable. So what exactly are these relaxed CFI rules? Well, they're also known as loose CFI. So instead of having unique labels for every possible transfer, they coalesce some of the transfers into either 2 or 3 labels. In the case on the right, we can see that there's one label for the indirect call, and that would be the same label for all indirect calls, and then one label for all returns. And so this then creates allowable transfers which aren't actually valid control flow transfers as seen by the original program, and that then can be exploited. And one form of this loose CFI is CFFIR.
Yeah, so here's a bit of background. So CFFIR is compact control flow integrity and randomization. Basically, this is the CFI that the paper attacks. So what CCFIR does is introduce this sort of springboard section into the code. So basically, this springboard is where all indirect calls or returns have to go through. So these indirect calls or returns will actually instead call or return to an address in this table, and then the table will translate then to an actual real address to call or return to. And yeah, as it says here, all the translations are pre-approved before the program starts. And if your address you're trying to return to or jump to is not in the table, it'll be rejected and the program will be terminated. So the question that the paper asks at first is CCFIR enough to stop hijacking the code? And the answer is no, due to call site and entry point gadgets, which will be discussed now. So call site gadgets, so here's the main problem, is that CCFIR does not make sure that the call and return addresses match. And it's very, very difficult to do this, as the paper goes into. And so the truth is we're allowed to return to any place right after a function call. So all addresses after a function call will be marked as able to be returned to, because they have to be returned to by the function call above them. So for example, here on the left, we have a vulnerable function where we do some kind of stack overflow, something like that, and we overwrite the return address. And we overwrite that return address to an address inside of the springboard table. And then we use that to jump to the middle of some other function. So at the bottom there, you see some other function. And we can actually jump to the instruction. We can return to the instruction right after we call the other function, even if that wasn't actually original control flow. And we can use this as a call site gadget, because basically it begins after a call and it ends at the return below it, when we can chain them as well. And the other gadget they introduced was an entry point gadget. So the other CCFIR also allows us to call any address right after the start of a function. So that's just a normal function call. So it marks all these addresses as able to be called, because it needs to be called somewhere into the program, and everywhere else you cannot call. So the problem is we can actually we can call this function instead. We can call a function instead of the intended function by overriding the function pointer inside of the code. So you can see here, we go down here, we return, and when we return, we actually end up jumping to a function rather than returning to the previous function instead by overriding a function pointer.
So a lot of this background on gadgets is a build up to kind of the main contribution of the paper, which introduces what they call a proof of concept or POC exploit, where they take a real world application, real world software, in this case, Internet Explorer 9, and kind of demonstrate how even with defenses like CCFIR, as well as other defenses we've discussed, like ASLR and DEP, it's still demonstrated to be vulnerable to return-oriented programming, ROP. And the paper outlines kind of their how the exploit works, right? So the first kind of setup step is where they use JavaScript on the browser to kind of use heap overflow techniques to achieve a couple of things. Firstly, they use a memory disclosure vulnerability, which basically allows us to kind of locate where the springboard is, because if we do that, we effectively bypass ASLR, and that reveals where the function stubs are, and that gives us kind of the gadgets to work with for ROP, right? Secondly, we then kind of, after we get the addresses of the gadgets we want, we kind of chain them together into like kind of the ROP sequence that we want into a fake stack of gadget addresses. And then we inject that along with the intended shellcode to execute at the end into the heap area of the application, and that'll be used for later. And then of course we kick off the ROP chain with an initial entry point gadget, like Jacob mentioned. We overwrite a function pointer to kind of have an initial entry point gadget. And after that, the first thing we kind of do is actually the paper tries to gain control of a return instruction. And the reason we do that is because we want to switch from entry point to call site gadgets, right? Recall the distinction between EP and SCS that Jacob just mentioned. It turns out that because under CFI, it's EP gadgets are a lot more restrictive. So we try to gain control of call site gadgets. And the reason we do that is because we want to do a technique, what's called a stack pivot, right? Remember the stack that we introduced in the setup step? We kind of want to redirect the stack pointer to our ROP stack such that the returns of each call site gadget kind of chain together our ROP chain, right? And that is what executes our ROP program, which in this case, the kind of like what we want to execute is two functions, right? Virtual protect and memcopy, which in combination effectively make this part of the code executable. I mean writable, which is already executable, and then we memcopy the shellcode into it so that we can execute it. So when the final ROP chain kind of completes, it returns into the shellcode, and then the system is compromised, right? So to bring this back into like course content, this is kind of a culmination of a lot of things we've discussed, right? This is a code reuse vulnerability as well as a code injection vulnerability.
And then for the evaluation methodology, they use IDA Pro to disassemble the PE files of Internet Explorer, Firefox, Adobe Reader, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, along with their libraries, collecting the statistics on the gadget types usable under CFI. So you can see in the table here, all the different types of gadgets, the call site gadgets, and the entry point gadgets, and then how many of these are found in the maximum file, the minimum file, and then all of the files there.
Yeah. So basically what this shows us that, so firstly, the main takeaway is that, of course, CCFIR is still vulnerable to ROP, namely memory disclosure, like the step where we kind of bypass ASLR. It effectively nullifies what CCFIR brings to the table, right? The springboard mechanism, as long as we know where it is, the authors of the paper demonstrate that we can effectively reduce this to just a loose CFI problem. And then furthermore, by bypassing DEP, we can kind of escalate the attack into code injection, which is a lot more dangerous than just code reuse, right? We also show that it works on real world software like Internet Explorer, and based on the evaluation metrics, we see that there was based on the gadget frequencies, this is a viable attack on a lot of other real world applications as well. But we do note that this does require a lot of things to go right on the attacker's end. So this doesn't completely discredit the value that CCFIR brings. Rather, it just like raises the bar for attackers.
And then for potential future work, I'd be interested to see them further generalize the results. Like as we talked about, they focus on 6 cherry-picked applications, all of which were on Windows 7 and 8. So it would be interesting to see an investigation on a wider range of applications, especially on different systems and operating systems, just to see if this is actually applicable to a wider range of areas, and that like how widespread this possible attacks are. And then also I would be interested to see them reconduct the research on modern hardware, specifically because this paper was published in 2014. And since then, Intel developed the control flow enforcement technology, or CET, which enables the use of shadow stacks, which is one of the defenses that they propose in the paper. And so it's kind of would be interesting to see if any of this still applies. And then like, if so, how much security does the shadow stacks bring? And then obviously, then most importantly, investigating the potential defenses is really important. Like the ones they said at the end of the paper, although they briefly mentioned them, like shadow stacks, and then also possibly investigating control flow locking, and even possibly just changing the number of IDs instead of 2 or 3 to just have it some increase, and seeing like what kind of security that provides.
Yeah, so we just have a couple of discussion points. I'm not sure if we have much time left, but a couple of questions here. So is there any more restrictive framework than CCFIR which can prevent these attacks while still being more efficient than CFI? So somewhere maybe in the middle between the two. The attack is also orchestrated with a heap overflow, springboard, finding the springboard, bypassing DEP, ROP. This question arises, which step is the weakest link in the chain? And finding that weakest link is what enables us to compromise the system. So even if we have a very secure control flow integrity like CCFIR was, if we are able to bypass that with by getting around ASLR, then it ends up not really mattering because we're into the system anyways. And I think I'll skip the last one because we're already out of time, but thank you.
Well, I mean, we're supposed to discuss the discussion.
Yeah, okay.
questions.
Anyone want to discuss the discussion questions? Yes.
Second bullet point, I feel like the heap overflow is actually probably the weakest chain in the link, because it's like you can actually I think securing the heap is something that like some people have explored, but that isn't done that much in practice, because it's like it's something that can have a huge performance impact, especially if you like say like add a guarding page to every single heap allocation. Like that there are heap allocators out there that will do that, but it's like really inefficient. So I think maybe that's the weakest link, and I haven't seen much research on that yet, personally at least.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the paper like they make mention of the technique called like heap spraying, which actually when we researched it, it in and of itself is not actually a security vulnerability by itself. It's when it's paired with another technique, like for example, using the DLL base addresses to compute where the springboard is. That's when it kind of becomes like a vulnerability that enables this kind of ROP to happen. Interesting.
Yeah, and we could maybe even like harden CCFI-R even further without the heap by maybe moving it to some protected memory, more protected memory, so that it wasn't, or it's randomizing its address separately from the ASLR, something like that, where it's not compromising ASLR, but doesn't necessarily compromise the springboard. Maybe that might be something to investigate as well.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. And we're on to Q&A if anyone has any questions.
Thank you. Say CCFIR.
Yeah,
Right.
it's annoying to say.
Cool. So
And
this was one of the examples of one of an attack scenario that, as you can see, there are here, I mean the next group can come and set up. There are real world challenges when we talk about things CFI, and attackers can utilize that unfortunately for their benefit. And yeah, the nice thing about newer technologies that CET, for example, is something that's coming as the standard in Intel processors. So many of these attacks no longer work with that, but still an open problem. All right, pointer authentication.
All right, yeah, I'm Ishan,
I'm Sid. I'm Parsha.
and today we'll be discussing the paper called Pack It Up Towards Pointer Integrity Using ARM Pointer Authentication. That's us. Yeah, so basically the problem is memory corruption attacks. And the issue is that we want to protect pointer integrity, which so attackers can't otherwise change programs' benign behavior. And there's two main memory corruption attacks we're focusing on today. The first one is control flow attacks, such as return-oriented programming. And these modify function return addresses or function pointers to hijack execution. And later in the paper, we'll discuss this paper mainly discusses a method to verify the return address integrity, which we'll go into later. And then the second type of memory corruption attack we wanted to talk about today is data-oriented attacks, where the attacker tries to modify non-control data, such as variables, to change program behavior within the control flow. So pointer authentication is a current solution which was introduced in ARM's version 8.3 architecture. It's basically a hardware security feature, and it uses pointer authentication codes, also known as PACs. And these act like cryptographic signatures for pointers and essentially prevent unauthorized modification of pointers. And these are basically stored within the unused bits of the pointer, so there's no additional memory cost. And this is a quick example. So the return address is stored within the link register. And when it's in the link register, it can't be altered. But once it's on the stack, it can be altered by the attacker. So what we do is before we store it in the link register, we generate a pack. And this pack takes in the pointer return address, the key, which is generated by the hardware, and some sort of modifier. In this case, the modifier we use is the actual stack pointer. And we generate a pack and we embed it in the return address and then store that in the link register. Then when we're done with the function call, we want to verify if the return address is correct. So we verify the packs and yeah, we check if we're good. But however, there are limitations to this approach because there's something called a pointer reuse attack, where attackers can reuse an old packed pointer. And basically, in this example, we have two functions. And for example, when we call function one, we create the stack frame and put the return address with the pack onto the stack frame. But as the function executes, the stack grows and shrinks. So basically, at some point, we may come to the same stack pointer multiple times. And basically, if we're at that stack, if we're at a certain stack pointer, we can the attacker can kind of save the path plus return address at that stack pointer. Then when it lets function two run, and if function two at some point reaches the same stack pointer, then it can actually swap the saved pack from return address one in the place of return address two. And basically, it can change the control flow of this even if there is PA. And yeah, and another reason is this only protects against return address attacks. We also want to protect against data pointers and code pointers. So Harsha will talk about parts, which is the implementation.
Yeah, so basically, like Ishan was just discussing, that there are some limitations to PA, mainly with the return addresses and having complete control over code pointers and data pointers. So this is parts. Parts is basically pointer authentication runtime safety, where we basically want to create something that controls the control flow and has pointer integrity, but still can protect against reuse attacks. So how we're protecting against reuse attacks is parts uses a combination of the current stack pointer technique that PA uses, but also creates a unique ID that basically verifies each time and authenticates based on that. This ensures that the pointers will not be changing from creation to use. So at the bottom here, you see how it normally is in pack, where we just store the LR and just return it. But then with parts, we also get an ID that we're able to authenticate each time. This makes it much harder for return addresses to be susceptible to return attacks. Next is basically with data and code pointers. So parts adds runtime safety with this, and it does the same thing. It basically generates a type ID during compile time that is authenticated to protect against these reuse attacks. At the bottom here, you see that data pointer and code pointer signing is basically just using the type ID, while return address signing is using that type ID plus the stack pointer. So, for example, like in this code pointer signing, you have something that it's basically on use. So they basically just want to check the code whenever it's run. They don't want to check it constantly. So there's no intermediate authentication with this. The type ID is assigned at compile time and it's just used. So on the right in the code, you see that it is when the pointer is created, it's the code is authorized, and then it's authorized again on use. On the other end with the data pointers, it's on compile time, because the issue with data pointers is if we're constantly checking the same like data type each time, it can quickly add into overhead. So we want to ideally do it just when we're loading it up on the register. This is also how we can prevent against register spills. So on the right, you see that once it's loaded, that is when authentication is done. Next, the last thing we want is pointer compatibility. Pointer compatibility is important for parts because we want this to be able to work on a lot of different systems. How this is done is with the LLVM compiler, which basically is a compiler that's able to be used on multiple systems. And how we do this is we put the source code, and the source code is basically incrementally modified in a way that can work as an executable on different systems. And this is why parts is able to be like a very viable solution to this.
So now really the big concern with something like this is what's the overhead? Because in general in cybersecurity, we have to be careful with adding too much overhead at the expense of security. So as we can see with code pointers, so making sure the return address to some function is correct, it adds a very low overhead, 0.5% increase in runtime for these various tests. And that's because code pointers aren't actually very frequent in the code compared to data pointers, which have a pretty large, nearly 20% overhead. And you can see that this is apparent in things like num sorting or sorting strings, because we're accessing the data so many times that when we're doing this part system, it adds some overhead. Whereas in some things like a neural net, where it's mostly calculation without this sort of memory access issue, there is a lower overhead. And now looking into the work that they had, they really want to tackle this overhead problem. So the authors of this paper have been extending parts to different different domains. They've been minimizing this code pointer overhead, and they have a new paper out about that. And also in general, in the potential work, they're really trying to I think that they should try to minimize the use of parts in these data pointers, which is the main overhead. So seeing where they can shave off some time, and also integrating it with other types of memory safety like the other presentations we'll hear today will really make sure that we have an overall very robust system. And now for the discussion questions. We have a little bit of time, so hopefully we can discuss a bit. With this 20% performance overhead, there's sort of this complexity of how much should we balance security versus the performance when deciding to use parts. Does anyone have any ideas for how they think that they would approach this? Or maybe some factors that they'd consider? Sure.
Maybe you could like enable or disable it on certain applications.
Yeah.
Maybe in a secure like data center, you turn that on, but like maybe on your own laptop, you don't really care.
Yeah, sure. Or things like seeing specific programs, maybe if they're especially vulnerable, if they're holding some very confidential information. And also now, how might we integrate parts into some of this legacy code? Like, what are some methods we could use to make sure that this is very accessible going backwards in time? If anyone has any ideas. Sure. So we could sort of add these wrappers which can automatically change, for example, like the C library to change some of these standard functions to use parts in their code. And when using parts on things like Internet of Things devices or embedded systems, things where misusing the data might be very important, what are some challenges that we could hit when using this sort of low-powered machine? If anyone has any ideas. Yeah, we sort of have to worry about this overhead being too large for a system like that. So this kind of goes back to our first point of ensuring that we are very careful and stringent about what we use parts for while still protecting all of the vulnerable parts of the system. Yeah, in the back.
How like the stack kind of easily put in a function, it's like it has a user input of like seeding a certain number of like bytes.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Are there any other questions about the paper? Great. Well, thank you all so much.
Is there any way that hardware, like, you can accelerate some of these at hardware? Did they just fix this?
So I think in the paper they talked about how they didn't have access to this hardware emulation, and so they had talked about using this in future work. But I think that is probably what they will pursue when looking at how to fix this with data pointers.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Please also don't forget to write and submit the reviews, right? So all the presenters today should submit reviews, and then everyone who did it in the first week.
Buddy. Okay, cool. So here's our paper. It's about control flow bending. It's kind of like a meta paper about control flow integrity. And then
I'm Runen.
I'm Lara.
and I'm Kai. And then here's the problem that we're trying to address. So basically, the paper was kind of talking about how in 2015, when it was published, it was saying that the papers recently published about CFI had an issue where they weren't really accurately measuring how effective their control flow integrity schemes were. So there's a specific metric they wanted to target called like average indirect target reduction that I'll talk about later. And they're basically saying this metric isn't actually meaningful for all the CFI schemes published. So this paper was specifically pointing out how CFI had an inherent limitation and how important shadow stacks were, even though they weren't included in some of the recently published stuff. And as a result, they showed a case study of some attacks on these various schemes using their own method. to show how important it was and how necessary shadow stacks were for all the CFI stuff. Okay, so what is wrong with CFI? Specifically, the metric that we're talking about kind of says how effective is CFI in stopping an attacker from reaching addresses they're not supposed to reach? And the issue they pointed out was if you looked at all those recent papers in 2015, every single one of them had effectiveness of like 99%, but that wasn't actually a good evaluation of how secure their CFI methods were because of the like 1% or less that AIR didn't of the 1% or less targets that CFI wasn't able to stop the attacker from reaching, a lot of those were actually useful. So the paper is trying to show that actually this like 1% is actually a very meaningful metric, and CFI research needed a better method to evaluate this stuff.
And I'll be talking about the software attack approaches. So first, the most common attack vector is the exploitation of memory corruption within programs written in memory unsafe languages. And I'll be skipping directly to discussing non-controlled data attacks. So this is where the attacker corrupts data, but not a code pointer. So code pointers being like return addresses or function pointers. And the methodology here is to corrupt a parameter to a sensitive function like libc's execv, or to override security configuration variables or disable security checks. And this is dangerous because most current efforts are focused on the protection of code pointers themselves. So the paper then also presented control flow bending, or CFB. So this is where a control flow data modification is allowed if the modified indirect branch target is part of the valid set of addresses defined by CFI. And so this means that the attacker still has to adhere to the imposed security policy. And this is different than a data-only attack, because in a data-only attack, you can only modify the arguments to a function. But with the control flow bending attack, you can do any control flow transfer as long as the transfer is part of the control flow graph. So what are the different CFI flavors? So there's the fully precise static CFI, which is the most restrictive policy that does not break the program's functionality. And this is where indirect control flow transfers along an edge are allowed only if there exists a non-malicious trace that follows that edge. And this is used in the paper's tests and results in order to like make more meaningful analysis. And then there's also practical CFI, which is like the actual implementation of CFI. And this is limited by the implementable precision of the control flow graph. And this results in the set of allowed targets for a transfer being much larger than is necessary. That's presenting more possible attack venues. So what are the threat model and attacker goals? So the typical assumptions are that there are constraints on what the attacker can write and where, but the paper assumed just to account for more things, they assumed that the attacker can have full control over the memory at one point during the program. And the attacker goals are, just to quickly go over it, they're pretty self-explanatory. Arbitrary code execution, confined code execution, which is just like a subset of the first one, and then information leakage. So now evaluating practical CFI. So what was the error metric that Kai discussed earlier? So error is the relative reduction in average number of valid targets for all indirect branch instructions. And gadget reduction is a relative reduction in the number of gadgets that can be found at locations that are valid targets for an indirect branch instruction. So although these are the typical metrics used, they actually have very important and notable shortcomings. The most important being that they both fail to capture the importance and risk of the allowed control transfers, because even just a few gadgets that are still available can be used by the attacker to do an attack that will work. And so the most relevant metric should be the number of available gadgets and their usefulness. So the paper writers introduced the basic exploitation test, or BET, which is a simple test to rule out trivially broken CFI implementations. So what they do here is they select a minimal program, but still resembles like a real life application. And then they determine whether attacks are still possible while this program is protected by the CFI scheme being evaluated. And so here's an example that they presented where they use a coarse-grained CFI policy, which was like strict, just to put it shortly, but had a high error and gadget reduction numbers, but still the attacker was able to achieve all their goals. So after identifying the gadgets in which they could load registers, do an arbitrary memory write, do an arbitrary memory read, and do arbitrary calls, they were able to do the following attacks. So they're able to execute arbitrary system calls by using the kernel v6 call, which was a call using a call gadget. And they're also able to use the libc's wrapper functions, because within some of the wrapper functions, there was a call instruction. And so under the control flow graph, you can return to any instruction after a call instruction by just using a return gadget. And they were also able to use the mprotect function to make already mapped code writable, thus allowing them to inject malicious code that they can then return back to, thus allowing the attacker to do all three of the goals that I mentioned earlier. And the conclusion is that the error and gadget reduction metrics fail to indicate whether the CFI scheme is actually effective.
Okay. So next, the paper went into the ways that in which the authors actually were attacking CFI protected programs. They first talked about the shadow stack, which also a couple the presentations before have mentioned, but the importance of the shadow stack in the sense that the shadow stack, when a function returns, is able to corroborate with its return address that it's returning to, along with the shadow stack, which is a protected region of the address space, and that the program is able to tell that it's returning to the right place. With a shadow stack, it is a lot harder to attack against a CFI protected program, but it's still possible, as seen with the different types of attacks that they presented in the paper. So first was a dispatcher function, which is a type of function that is able to overwrite its own return address and then therefore be able to return somewhere else. So the most notable example that they mentioned was memcopy, which is, you can see on the slide, like that's its arguments, and it just copies one portion of memory into another. And so if you're able to copy the attacker controlled memory into the location of where the return address for memcopy is itself, you can redirect it to be wherever you want in the program. Second was the concept of loop injection, which uses the dispatcher functions to create a loop within the actual process. You can see an example of this on the right on the slide, in which instead of, for the second call, of call to the function func prolog b whatever, for the second call, instead of returning back just to the instruction right after the call, it could return earlier in the program's execution, thus creating a loop, and then the attackers could as a result create some sort of attack, whatever they wanted to do. Okay. And then another type of attack that the authors mentioned was printf oriented programming. I won't get too far into this because it's kind of complicated and takes a while to understand, but the overall effect is that it would do the computation in like the bold up there, where based on a conditional value, it would write the value at X into a memory location T. And it's all by using printf, the function in C, and using the specialized format string that uses specifically like the %n specifier that writes into a memory location the number of bytes that were previously written. And so if you want to understand the entire attack, you can read that, but it takes a while. Okay, and so based on all of these attacks, the authors then used them in order to understand how safe and reliable CFI was, which in short it isn't. The first two I'll go more into, which are Nginx and Apache. And so Nginx, the way that they attacked this program was using a stack-based buffer overflow attack that modified an internal data structure. And so they would replace the internal data structure using mcopy with the method that I just mentioned. And then based on what was inside the like attacking internal data structure, it could enable control flow embedding attacks. But an important detail is that this is without the use of a shadow stack. And so with a shadow stack, this wasn't possible. And you can see on the bottom of the slide is that there's a summary for each of these different 6 case studies and the differences of how well the attackers or the authors could perform attacks, whether they were using a shadow stack or not. And there are some clear differences for some of them, but the most important takeaway is that most of these case studies were still able to execute these certain attacks even with a shadow stack. The second case study I'll go into is Apache, or what was it?
Apache.
Apache. Yeah, sorry. My bad. In which CFI was actually able to successfully protect the program against arbitrary rights, but it wasn't able to protect against confined and arbitrary code execution, which was interesting and showed how sometimes a CFI could protect against certain things, but not others. The other ones were use other attacks, and you get the point. Not necessarily to go into them that much. Okay.
Alrighty. So there's a lot of potential future work that we found. Specifically, this paper is kind of a call to action for improving the state of CFI research. And as a result, you can read through these, but then we looked through and we found a lot of research that actually cites the specific work and has the specific improvements that the paper is calling for, which I found was pretty interesting. So we had some questions for you guys, and also if you have any questions about what we presented, please let us know.
Is the basic exploitation test something they automated or something they like took from another paper?
I think they came up with it themselves, I believe. They were just trying to say like this is the most basic metric you could use, and someone should improve on this and create like an actually useful one. And actually,
So it's like not like a trivial test. So sorry, it is a trivial test. So that means that like just because it passes the bet test or bet, just because it passes bet doesn't mean that it's like actually safe. It's just that if you fail it, it's for sure not safe. That's all.
yeah, they just want to point it out. And then we did actually find in some of the resulting research, they did come up with like automated testing schemes for CFI. It's like specifically the confirm paper was an interesting one if you want to read through that.
Any other questions? I think this is a good paper. If you have a programming interview, you want to learn your C and pointers, this is a good paper. It just plays with printf to do like memory changes, which is very good.
Yeah, there's like a really long appendix section that I thought was pretty interesting. So
Oh, and all about like Turing complete stuff. I don't know.
Yeah,
I learned a lot.
you can learn how the pointer operates, which is usually a very hard thing to understand in most of the programming courses. All right, thank you guys.
thank you.
Let's have it ready. Yeah. Board's paper.
Yep.
One person gonna be on Zoom. So that's why we have.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, so we are group 5, and my name is Tony. And
I'm Tianxi. I'm Tsinghua. I'm Han.
so we are presenting the topic called dynamic control flow graph recovery for the embedded firmware binaries. And let's start with the problem statement. So basically, traditional control flow graph recovery, they usually having issue with recover from firmware binaries. And what's a firmware binaries? That's basically a part of the code, like it heavily interact with the hardware. And for backgrounds, so key scope of the paper is to solving this issue. So it's able to let the CFG able to cover from the embedded device. And this kind of device actually is pretty commonly seen in our real life. For example, maybe this projectiles, these monitors, maybe this Wi-Fi. As long as it's gonna have a chip inside and it's like a microcontroller, they got it's an embedded device. So it's actually got a pretty widely usage in this kind of topic. And the control, that's the background for the CFG. So as mentioned in last class, so a CFG, they have edges and nodes. So nodes is basically single entries and exit points, and inside is like code, the instructions. And we got edges connecting all the nodes. So it's like a tree diagram presenting the whole control flow of a program. And what's the challenge in here? So for a traditional CFG recovery method, they fail to recover for binary code. That's because the hardware related issues. So for example, in here, so if you run the CFG in the main thread, so what happens on the SR thread, you may never know. So that's an issue, and Tianqi will talk about it later. And also there got an issue like interrupt. And so yeah, now we're entering our topic called force firmware execution engine.
Oh, okay. Let me show you how detailed that why. Let me talk about the details about why the traditional CFG fails. Let me compare the traditional software and firmware reality side by side. And for the traditional software, you have the predictable execution flow and operation system handling the hardware interaction, and it always have typical direct function call. But for the firmware reality, we have more complex flow, and that means that hardware interruption can occur at any time, breaking normal execution flow. Second, the direct memory map IO means value. You can change the values unpredictably. And third, the callback function are registered dynamically, creating indirect control flows. And here is some cross concept in the final firmware analysis. And the challenge will intercept up to our course. And so in the binary analysis, remember our discussion on the control flow recovery traditional method, assuming the predictable execution path, but hardware states make the path expansion exponentially more complex. And the static control might struggle with the hardware dependent value, so we should probably use the dynamic one. And for the computer architecture, because we are using the memory map input output here, and it will enable direct hardware access, interrupt handling mechanism will affect the program flow, and the complexity of that complexity of the hardware state will make the
our management to be more hard. And for the system security, because of the characteristics of the firmware, we should create a unique attack surface. And for the vulnerable analysis, there should be significantly more complex, and we need to consider a more cross-layer attack on it. And so for this concept, we should have a successful approach must track all memory access, especially for the hardware register, and handling the interrupt event and resolve dynamic callback interrelationship and manage complex state interaction. And Qinghua will continue talking about that.
There are three key innovations for the FFXE. The first one is volatile memory tracking. It is like a smart monitor. It will monitor the memory locations where callback functions might be registered during execution. During program execution. The second one is the context preservation. It captures the system status at the critical memory access points. And the third one is the cross-thread analysis. It connects these pieces by restoring relevant execution context when the volatile memory is written to it. So this combination makes the FFXE more very effective. The workflow is pretty straightforward. It starts by pre-executing the reset handler to send up the initial status, and after that, it will begin forced execution on each node ISR entry point in the vector table, and after that, it will back up the emulator execution state at each volatile memory read in the ISR context, and these steps track all the ISR entry points and the memory accesses, and after that, when the voluntary memory is accessed, it will save the complete execution context. And after the memory location is written, it will restore the relevant context and continue. Looking into the experiment result, the FFXE has significant improvements over other existing tools, and the experiment on 36 firmware samples has shown that it has reflect that it had achieved 100% callback function detection, and also a much better code coverage compared to both dynamic and static analysis tools. And in terms of speed, it is much faster than the Anger's emulated methods, and at the same time, it also add a minimal overhead to its original implementation.
All right, thank you, Qinghua. Let's move to the discussion in the future work. So just as mentioned in the experimental result, the FFXE can dynamically resolve the indirect branches, which will then enable the accurate CFG recovery compared to the other static and dynamic tools. And let's say the figure 5 shown here. In the first two columns is two kind of dynamic techniques, and we can find that. So firstly, we have to understand the purple part is a part. Both the techniques showing in the figure and the FFXE can cover, and the blue part is only one which the FFXE can cover, and the red one is the only one for the technique showing in the figure. And we can, from the first two columns, we can see that they are seldom red part and they are large blue part. That means FFXE can not only cover the part for these two dynamic techniques, but also have a larger range to cover. So which means it will be better. And then for the static techniques, as shown from the on this column, and this column, we can see that this kind of two techniques actually have a larger cover range than the FFXE. But here's the problem: it has a larger range, but is that better? Actually, it's not because this kind of a two static techniques will it with a is a low accurate, which will have a maybe the wrong address or that code, this kind of things. But the FFXE will have a higher accuracy. So maybe if we combine the FFXE with this kind of techniques, it will be a better choice, just as shown from the column here and here. Then let's move on. And here, let's move on to the real world formula. Just as I mentioned, the first point, pretty important for the FFXE is that it always has a complementary utility with other existing techniques, which means that they can be combined together and used together, have a better performance. And the second point is that the FFXE actually ensure CFG recovery with a higher accuracy. But for any different kind of method, it should have some shortcomings. So on the left side is the shortcomings of the FFXE. Maybe it need a higher memory usage. Maybe it has an invalid state and so on. So the future work, of course, should have to relate it to the shortcomings mentioned here, such as we can try to like reduce unnecessary state storage to improve the efficiency. Then we can optimize the memory usage. So as a conclusion, the FFXE do have some innovations, but maybe the combination of the FFXE and other existing tools is the best way to do the CFG recovery. Thank you. And then let's move to the question part. We have some question here.
Do you have anyone to want to engage?
Yeah, maybe start from the first one.
The FF. Oh,
I guess like looking at the first one, like since I'm part of the team that's working on the ECTF project here, and like I'm thinking like this is actually something that might be useful for us because it's like currently like we run our thing just through QEMU and like not through like Unicorn or like Anger, and like if we integrate like say this technique into our paper, we might be able to find things that we haven't, because I know that like on the board working on, there are actually interrupts, and currently in one of the interrupts we actually use the UART because that was in the sample code given to us, and there might be like some really suspicious things going on there, so maybe this might be helpful to us actually.
Yeah, should try it.
Yeah. And
Do you guys using Anger or any?
No, we're just using QEMU right now, so we're just like emulating, we're not doing any analysis.
Okay, I mean, but I mean, can you just give you the traces and then you're looking at the traces manually?
I mean, we're just running it right now. We're not like we're not actually.
You're not debugging.
Yeah, we're not debugging.
We're still on first getting it working.
I see.
It is
Oh,
working.
okay.
As of when I came here, Tom, I started working.
It is. Anyway, so let's discuss this. All right, I think we don't have much time, so let's thank.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, okay, so if you remember, we start discussing remote attestation. Let me just maybe take a step back. So we kind of talk about various solutions in order to make sure that our system is running correctly. We started talking about static analysis and dynamic analysis. You've seen some papers today discuss various different aspects of this, attacks and defenses and shortcomings, and then some other methods that's kind of completely looking at this differently, such as like, blinding information and so on and so forth. And this is a very active, still an active area of research. It's actually closely integrated with industry. That's where you see actually some of these security techniques are indeed integrated in real systems. For example, Intel has CET, which implements shadow stacking. ARM has pointer authentication, which basically authenticate codes and you can actually access it via particular commands in the ISA. So there are actually, these are indeed, you can see it in real world. So it's not just, some research topic. But of course, they're still dealing with lots of problems, including, the performance hits and costs and so on. So one idea that many people are going after is maybe I don't need to have some form of a runtime
checks that kind of like active all the time. Maybe I need to just have some notion of security, where I need to like occasionally check the status of the device and see whether I can continue to trust this device or not. And this is where we are talking about remote attestation. The idea of remote attestation is not enforcing security on the device, but rather having some sort of a proof that this device is still in some known and good state. Okay, how do we do that? We use this challenge, response paradigm, this two-player game paradigm, where there is a prover and there is a verifier. The prover is the device that we want to check the status of. The verifier is some form of a trusted device that we trust and we know that it works correctly. The idea is that the verifier sends some form of a challenge, which we're going to describe what it is. The prover going to take that challenge and compute some response to it. Okay. So for example, think about the challenge response to, I send a message and then the prover has to decrypt the message and send back to me the actual, I send an encrypted message, the prover send me the decrypted message, for example, right? So this way the prover can prove that they have access to the secret key and so on and so forth. But here particularly we want the challenge to be the hash, the hash of the content of the memory of the prover. The idea is that if the prover can show that the content of its memory has not been modified, it means that this device can be trusted because nothing exists in this program or in this device that has been changed. Okay, so that's the kind of the idea of the prover. So we do it all by computing the response. In this case, the response is a hash over the content of the memory and send the result back to the verifier. The verifier also has a copy of the content of the memory. So the verifier can also compute the hash and compare these two hashes, the hash that's sent by the prover versus the hash that they compute themselves. If these two match, means that this the prover still can be trusted. Yes.
So this hash would be computed over like the firmware, right? Not like any like dynamically changing memory.
So the question is that do we hash what exactly are we hashing? Yes, we are hashing the code, not the data, because the data of course is changing, but the code is not. And these are usually devices that are simple. So for example, think about like a security camera, a voice recorder, more of like a low-end IoT devices, which don't necessarily go through even data changes much. So the expectation is that the content of the memory stays the same. But then you can update them as well, right? So for example, if there is like a firmware update, you update the code, but you have to make sure that you also update the hashes. All right, so the kind of the big challenge in attestation is that this mechanism has to work under a condition where the device is already compromised. If the device is not compromised, then things are straightforward. I send a challenge, I wait for the hash, I compute it, that's great. Everything will match. But now assume that the device is already compromised, right? So using all these different techniques that we describe in this class, using sensors or memory, anything like that, the device is already compromised. Remote attestation in this case has to fail. And we want a mechanism that guarantees that if the device has been compromised, this attestation cannot pass, which means that at least we know that this device is compromised and we can do other things, okay? So that's some important things about remote attestation, that the adversary cannot lie in this process. If they can lie, then it doesn't make any sense to use remote attestation. We talked about various different attack scenarios last time, if you remember. We said that, for example, the attacker can dynamically move the memory and change the content. The attacker can like pre-record some hash, and whenever it's been asked, basically just replay that. The attacker can ask another device to compute the hash for them. There are various different attack scenarios that is happening in this case. So the system has to be robust against these attacks. So let's actually talk about them a little bit more. So there are two important things that we want to make sure that the system is secure against. The first one is what we call forging, which means that the attacker should not be able to forge the response. There are many different ways, as we're going to discuss. So that's the main thing, that if the device is compromised, we want to see the response from that compromised contents, which means that the hash computation should be different than the original computation. The second problem that we need to make sure that the system is not vulnerable about is if the attacker changed the memory, but remember the previous hash, the system shouldn't work and shouldn't pass the test. So this is what we call a replay attack, where the adversary basically doesn't really compute the hash, but just keep replaying what they has been computed before. So the simple thing about replay attacks, as we discussed last time, was you can basically fix this by using some form of a randomization in your challenge. That's why we are sending a challenge. You don't just ask for a response. You first send a challenge so that we can change this challenge every time that we request it. And then for the response, then we make the response dependent on this challenge. So what we do is that we're kind of saying that, okay, if you're using a hash, okay, what you can do is that saying that if you're using the hash of the memory, maybe I can seed you the hash. So essentially, you're not seeding you're not only hashing the memory, you're hashing the memory and the seed together, which means that this is kind of like, if you remember, the hash function was kind of a repeated function, which was kind of the output is the input of the next round. So the first time we feed the seed, and the second time we just ask the memory to compute. So this way, if I change the seed, the hash will be different, okay? And there is guarantee that if I change the seed every time, even if the content of the memory is the same, the hash will be different. And the nice thing about this is that once I change the seed every time, the hash will be different every time. So even if I remember the previous hash, it won't help the adversary. The adversary needs to compute the hash every time that we are sending the challenge, okay? So that's why this is a challenge response paradigm, as I said. We use a nonce, and that's kind of fix the issue of replay attacks, but that doesn't fix the issue of forging, because the adversary can still lie about the content of the memory. So what are the things that can be done in the forging? The key thing about forging attack is that relying only on the response will not be enough for protecting the system against these kind of attacks. Why? Because the adversary, basically what they do is they use the seed, but they can always save the old content of the memory somewhere in the memory and use that to compute the response, okay? So what we need to do is, essentially, the attestation protocol has to rely on two things. One is that it has to rely on the response. So the response has to be equal to the expected response. That's the original premise of attestation. But we are now adding the secondary condition, and that is that the computation has happened correctly. That is indeed this hash function has been computed on that particular device correctly using some algorithm that we know. So it's not just that, oh, here's your response, but you also want an evidence that shows that you have computed this response correctly. Okay, so that's how we're going to fix this forging problem. How do we basically create that response? There are various ways for secure remote attestation. How do we kind of achieve this second condition? You can use hardware. The assumption is that if the hash computations happens on some form of a trusted hardware, since the trusted hardware has not been modified, so the content of the memory might be modified, but the act of computation has not been modified and cannot be modified because it's baked into the hardware, then I can trust this second condition. And in that case, even if the content has been changed, the adversary has no control over how to compute the hash. So that's where we're gonna trust the response. Okay. So for example, if the content has been changed, the hash computation results in a different, hash. and that hash won't match this expected response, and then we know that this device is compromised. This is the premise of almost all the high-end systems that use trusted execution environments and remote attestation. For example, if you have heard about Intel SGX or ARM trust zones, that's how they're basically operating. They're using this hash computations inside the hardware so that nobody can change that. Of course, you might wonder that, oh, how do we know that the hardware is trusted? And are there ways that someone can penetrate through the hardware? There has been works that shows that this is also possible, but we're not going to go through the hardware attacks. Most of the time, you can kind of fairly, reliably trust the hardware. Okay. So hardware, of course, the downside of the hardware is that now you need to have a trusted platform module in the system, which could be expensive and could be high overhead, especially if you're talking about really, really low-end devices like a security camera and so on and so forth, which we may not have enough resources to have a dedicated hardware module. That's where we're kind of like looking at the other solutions. So the second solution is what we call software attestation, which the idea is that can I somehow use software itself without really relying on anything in hardware to achieve remote attestation? This is a very challenging problem, but people have shown that there are things that it can do. The most common way of using software is the time it takes to compute is the source of information. So people have shown that you can use time as the source of trust, although this is not as strong as hardware, because in hardware you can prove that things cannot be modified. But for time, things becomes very iffy, because yeah, you can use time for as a measure, but what if the adversary becomes more sophisticated and may manage to do things in shorter time and so on and so forth? That's why software attestation generally is not well liked because of that. But the nice thing about software attestation is that it's purely software, which means that it can run in any device. And then kind of like the best of both worlds kind of thing is the hybrid method, which is software hardware solutions. That what it tries to do is that using a little bit of hardware and a little bit of software such that it can achieve the guarantees of the of a hardware solution without the big, overheads that comes with hardware. We're gonna, for the rest of this lecture, we're gonna talk a little bit about each of them. And as I said, your CA3 would be just looking at the pure software solutions as one of the potentials. So if you remember about the hardware remote attestation, we talked about trusted platform modules for secure boot. The idea here is that we want to extend this into runtime, right? So during the boot, I can, for example, load things and hash things and make sure that the hash is correct. That's how we actually boot our operating systems or firmware. Now, the idea is that let's actually reuse that during the runtime, right? If I can't compute the hash one time, why don't I use it over during the real time and during runtime? So there are challenges with this, right? So the challenge is that now we need to somehow expose this to some remote user, right? So the trusted platform module is not something that when I turn on my computer, it's only gets activated. Now it needs to be somehow connected to the CPU and needs to be connected to the remote. So there is a software stack that needs to be now added to the whole system in order for this component to be exposed to the external world. There are a whole bunch of implementation challenges with it. And unfortunately, as you've seen, whenever I expose things to the external world, that also opens the can of worms for attacks. So things more secure if they are confined and isolated. Once you expose them, unfortunately makes it vulnerable to attacks. But this is basically the premise of what we call trusted execution environments, or TEEs. This is something that we're going to hopefully talk a little bit more on Wednesday if we have time. Otherwise, we might talk about it later in the course on the week 10. But there are generally, the key idea is that we take the TPM, which was, if you remember, it was like tiny piece of hardware that can run very simple code, and extend it such that it can run more sophisticated codes and more capabilities to it. And we expose it to the runtime. And that's why we call it trusted execution environments. There are various different design considerations. And as I said, this is actually very commonly used and very, very popular unit. in standard systems such as trust zone and SGX and SEV for AMD and so on and so forth. So we're going to check back this on Wednesday if you have time. But let's talk about other solutions. As I said, the main things for trusted execution environment is it comes with like large software and hardware overheads. So for low-end devices, we're kind of looking for a little bit lower hardware overheads. And that's where we kind of like rely on software or hybrid. So what is software attestation? The idea of software attestation is, can I rely on some form of an artifact when I'm computing to kind of get to confirm that this computation has happened correctly? Remember, I need two things. I need the response to be correct. I also need to know that this computation indeed happened on the device without modification. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. Remember that the idea was that the hash computation was this challenge response, right? The verifier sent a nonce N1. The prover will compute the hash and send the hash of memory plus nonce. To give you a little bit more detail to understand how software attestation works, important things about software attestation is that now we can divide the program memory into two main parts. One part is what we call a verification code. This is the code that is running when the attestation is happening. So the attestation itself has a code, right? So it says there's like a sequence of things that needs to be happening. That itself has a code. Plus, we need to check the condition of other, the status of the rest of the memory. Let's say, for example, in this case, we are worried about two things, the verification code and some application, just one application, but this could be extended to multiple applications, okay? So in this very bare bone system, we have two pieces of code. We have the verification code and we have the application code, and we want to compute the hash over these two things together. So here's the idea that we are going after. We're going to do what we call a self-checking code. Essentially, what we are going to do is that we're going to compute the hash over the verification code itself and send the response back to the verifier. What will happen is that this process is designed such that the verification is going to compute the hash over itself, okay? So and we're going to time this process of this hash computation. The idea is this, that if the verification code is compromised, it needs to do some other stuff during the verification computation, which will result in longer time for the computation itself. And the key thing is that we are computing the hash over its own code. So the idea is this, that let's say there are some line of code, okay? This line of code is, for example, is like some form of like, XORing or adding. So the hash function is kind of like this. So some memory, some operation. So like reading memory, things like that. What will happen is that we are not computing the hash over some other content. We are computing the hash over its own content. So these instructions that we are running to compute the hash, we are hashing themselves. Okay, so this is what we call self-checking. Since it's self-checking, I have two options as an adversary. Actually, I have only one option as an adversary. If I just run this code, okay, it means that I cannot change it, because if I change it, the hash function will be different, right? So either I need to kind of like, point this to some part else in the program, which results into some jumps back and forth, or I need to somehow request this hash computation to be computed somewhere else. And again, this will result into some additional handshaking, initialization, or post-processing after this computation. All in all, what would happen is that if I design this right, and if I make sure that this code cannot be optimized, what will happen is that the time it takes for this computation to finish will be very, very deterministic. Okay? So as a result, when I'm receiving this hash, now I have two things. One is the hash response, which telling me that this verification function has been executed itself. and here's the hash for it. So here's the proof that this verification function has been executed. And the second thing is that the adversary did not manipulate this process, because if they did, then the timing would have been off, because there will be additional jumps and there will be additional changes. So these together will give me the trust. Yes.
So the adversary could like even like diversity theory could put like a jump to like some other part of the code. And then have like the attestation code there and then compute it, but we're just assuming the like the few milliseconds that would take would be like too much, would be enough time to trigger. So
Yeah.
in like a distributed system, I guess, because like obviously this is communicating over a network, right? How would we kind of like know how like what we can how much time latency took just like from the network stuff, and how much time was spent executing on the actual device? Like how would
Yeah.
you distinguish?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we're doing this, the timing has to be very, very tight, so that if there is like one extra jump, that extra jump has a significant change in the delays. Okay, so there are two things that we do. One is we're trying to design, as I'm going to show you later, we're going to design this verification function such that it's not just only one jump. Is this jump is like we repeat this process over and over. So you put this into some form of a loop. So even single instruction change will multiply by the number of iterations of that loop. That's one thing that increases this delay. The second thing is that, yes, you're right, that we also, so this attestation time is the computation time plus the communication time, right? So this computation time, I'm arguing that if the adversary change the code, this will increase. But unfortunately, I have no control over this communication time. That's why, as I said, software attestation is not that great in that sense. So you need to make some assumptions. So for example, most of these systems assume that the network has low jitter, which means that the communication is very deterministic as well. So for example, we are in the same room on this part of the same network. That's why there is no like multiple hops. If I want to, let's say, check the status of a device in East Coast that has to go through multiple hops, then this method won't work. It will work if I just checking the camera here in this room, part of the same. So it works wirelessly, but the wireless network has to have low jitter. But that's a great question. That's why it's not working all the time. All right, so you get the idea. So once we get this verification code, then we trust this part. This becomes our dynamic root of trust. Now I know that my verification code hasn't been modified. Then I'm going to use that to verify everything else. So if I want to check other application code, other things, I use verification. So at this point, after this process, I trust my verification code. Then I'm going to use that to compute the rest of the program. This is what we call a self-checking technique that I'm going to explain you a little bit more next time on Wednesday as well. All right. Thank you, guys.